If you have your Bible, you will want to open up to Isaiah 51-ish. We'll be moving around a little bit. I don't know why, but I love that sound that just all the way through the room. There are some things you just can't unsee, right? Have you ever had that experience? You just can't unsee something you've seen. It's stuck with you forever. Years ago, someone told me that if you look at Tom Cruise's teeth, you will see that he has a single tooth right in the center of his mouth. And I didn't think much of it until I was watching a movie with him in it. And I remembered the center tooth deal. And so I paused it just to get a look. And no joke, he has had a single tooth right in the center of his mouth, in the center of his face. No big deal, right? Except that I can no longer see a picture of him without looking straight at his mouth and trying to, oh, yep, there it is. It's still there. This is unfortunate. Our passage this morning, yet now the rest of you are ruined to Tom Cruise's mouth. Our passage this morning is a bit like Tom Cruise's mouth. Stay with me. Specifically the passage that we heard Kristen read, Isaiah 52 through 13. Maybe you have read the New Testament. If so, you have maybe heard and considered the story of Jesus, the man who said, "I have come not to be served, but to serve." If you are familiar with this man who knew the grief of rejection and who angered those who he came to help, if you know this story of the one who says, "I have come to bear the sins of many," and who was called by his cousin John, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, if you recognize in the story of Jesus a man who was killed because he was thought to be a false prophet, and yet in the end was finally vindicated, exalted, and lifted up, if you know this story, you cannot unsee it in our passage this morning. If you've seen this story for yourself, you cannot read this passage, you cannot hear this passage and close your eyes, right, to the profound similarities between the story told about Jesus in the New Testament and the story that Isaiah tells about this suffering servant. There are just some things you cannot unsee. But seeing is not the same thing as understanding. And I've wondered sometimes if our standard reading of Isaiah's description of the suffering servant strips the passage of some of its power to call, its power to challenge, to convict, and to ultimately change us. Let me explain what I mean. I had this favorite radio Bible teacher when I was in college. And he was the first to really introduce me to this passage at all. It was by far one of his favorite passages, so that anytime he would come across any passage in the New Testament that either referred to or sounded like this passage, he would jump back and say, "See, look, Isaiah predicted this over 400 years earlier." And a couple times I heard him do a much more thorough connection where verse by verse he showed how each part of the Isaiah passage was coming true in Jesus in the New Testament. This is kind of what I mean by the standard way of reading Isaiah 52 and 53. It's what you might call the prediction reading. Isaiah was making predictions about a future Messiah, and Jesus came, and Jesus is the one who made those predictions come true. This is the way that I learned to read this passage, and I cannot unsee it that way. But what if there's more to see than just prediction about the future? I think it is prediction about the future, but I think that limits our vision of what's happening. What if it's more? And so step aside from our passage for just a second and think about some of the great literary masters of the last several hundred years. So Shakespeare, Mark Twain, Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, right? We recognize these names. Recently, each of these authors have had their work updated. Someone has come along and has made a contemporary version of these stories, of many of their stories. So Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew was transformed into the movie 10 Things I Hate About You. And Jane Austen's Emma, just 10 years ago, 20 years ago, was adapted into the movie Clueless. The idea behind a good adaptation taking an old story and bringing it into a new day, is that the newer version puts on sort of new, recognizable clothes on an older story, but sometimes the adaptation even twists themes or changes the themes for this new day, this new context. Can you imagine if your job was as a book or film reviewer, and the only thing you did in your reviews of these books that have been adapted or these movies that have been adapted was to point out all of the similarities or differences between the original and the new one? If all you did was say, oh, look, the new one is the same in these ways and it's different in these ways. But what does it mean? What does this new story mean? What's the story that this new one's telling, and how is its consistency with the old one meaningful, and how is the ways in which it parts meaningful? This is often how our reading of Isaiah 52 and 53 goes. We just are looking for similarities. Actually turn with me to Isaiah 53. Starting in verse 12, the last line, where we read, this is just one example, he was numbered with transgressors. And we go, ooh, see, Jesus was crucified between two criminals. Isaiah knew it was going to happen. Yay, Bible, right? Or jump up to verse 9. And they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death. And so this one is clearly about Joseph of Arimathea. Matthew goes out of his way in Matthew's gospel to tell us that Joseph was a rich man and that it was his grave that Jesus was buried in. And so, boom, predicted. It's all coming together, right? We like the prediction reading of this passage because it puts us in the role of investigator. We look at these two stories and we find similarities and we sort of see their connection and we say, look, they're connected. And we gain this sense of confidence in the trustworthiness of the Bible. But the investigator position also lets us off the hook. It lets us detach ourselves from the story in Isaiah so that we remain unaffected by it. The story becomes little more than a set of sort of interesting facts to prove with later stories from the New Testament. It becomes the source material for the adaptation. And so we watch 10 Things I Hate About You, and we're like, yeah, this is great, but we never think about what it means in light of the original or what the original story might have even been about. And so we lose the passage as truth that God has given us in order to help transform us. It's just a set of predictions, and that's all it is to us. And so this morning I want to explore the meaning of this passage before Jesus comes along and ever announces himself as the fulfillment of it. What does it mean for the people of Israel to hear this passage? So that when we turn to Jesus and we hear him saying these scriptures out loud, and he's saying, these are about me, we might better be able to understand what they mean. So, to do that, we have to look at the context of this wise servant who suffers for God's people. And if we think about last week's passage sort of dropped us in to this deep ocean of historical context. The people are in exile, and God has attempted to comfort these people by coming to them and saying, I know that you're in exile, you're outside of the land, but I'm coming. I'm going to set you free from your Babylonian captors, and I'm going to bring you back to the land where we're going to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. But, and I don't know if God is surprised by this, but the prophet seems to be surprised by this. There's reluctance. The people don't seem to be getting very excited about this. See, the people aren't actually sure they can trust God. God has announced that this Persian king is going to rise up as a conqueror, and he's going to defeat the Babylonians who are currently holding them captive, and he's going to set them free to return home. But the Israelites know, because they just went through this, that conquerors tend to do so violently. And so for a conqueror to come in and take out the Babylonians, this is going to be dangerous for them. And they've already suffered under the hands of conquerors. Is this really what we are looking forward to? And so we turn and we listen as God comforts these people and begins to speak words to them. So turn back to Isaiah 51, where the stage gets set for this passage. Starting in verse 12, we hear God say this, I I am he who comforts you. Who are you that you are afraid of man who dies, of the Son of Man who is made like grass, and have forgotten the Lord your Maker, who stretched out the heavens and laid the foundations of the earth, and you fear continually all the day because of the wrath of the oppressor, who, when he sets himself to destroy. And where is the wrath of the oppressor? Can you hear God's words? He's concerned with Israel's fear. Israel is afraid of these humans, of these human oppressors. They're afraid of this wrath. And so we jump down to verse 17, where God continues. We hear his words, wake yourself. So stand up, O Jerusalem, you who have drunk from the hand of the Lord the cup of his wrath. The people here are called to wake up. These are the people who have suffered the wrath of God, and they've lived to tell about it. And so one might imagine it makes sense that if you've suffered God's wrath, then what's human wrath? That's fairly manageable, that you should be able to stand up under that. There's nothing to be afraid of from these humans around you. Verse 19, God goes further to explain what's happening here. He says, these two things have happened to you, devastation and destruction, famine and sword. Who will comfort you? Your sons have fainted. They lie at the head of every street like an antelope in a net. They are full of the wrath of the Lord, the rebuke of your God. Here the Lord's wrath is further described. God's people have suffered greatly. Devastation and destruction, famine and sword. We read about these last week. It is seen in the children of God's people. They have been captured and they are weary, and they are marked by God's discipline. Therefore, hear this, we continue. You who are afflicted, who are drunk, but not with wine. And then here comes God's response. Thus says your Lord, the Lord, your God, who pleads the cause of his people. Whatever God's people have experienced, we discover that they still belong to God. The Holy One, the Lord, is still their God, and he still speaks on their behalf. And he says, next, behold, I have taken from your hand the cup of staggering, the bowl of my wrath you shall drink no more. Their suffering is done. God is ending it. But there's more happening here. And in the next chapter, what we discover is that the restoration of God's people has a sort of worldwide purpose to it. God has ended the suffering of Israel. He will bring them back to Jerusalem. And when he does, there will be singing. So in 52, verse 9, we hear, and this is part of what Anthony read for us earlier, we hear, break forth into singing, you waste places of Jerusalem, right? Imagine waste places actually singing with joy. For the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. Something new is happening. The Lord has bared his holy arm before the eyes of all the nations, and the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. We live in a highly individualistic context, right? And so some of this seems and feels so strange and so foreign to us. Essentially what's being said is that God allowed Israel to suffer as they were taken into exile. But God is bearing his holy arm to bring Israel back out of exile. And the purpose of this, why has he allowed all of this to happen? So that the nations would see. So that to the ends of the earth, the world might know that God has acted on behalf of his people. The salvation of Israel was not just for Israel's sake. God wanted the world to see him. The one who was capable of setting Israel free. God wanted to show himself off as the one who was able to bring beauty from the ashes that Israel had become. God was vindicating himself. He was declaring himself to be the one who speaks the truth and who has done what is good and right. If it's at all possible to get into the mind of God, right, a dangerous claim. But if we can somehow sort of try to imagine what in the world God is doing here and why God would be up to this, part of, I think, what the challenge for us is understanding how God feels, what God thinks about these people, Israel. God has said numerous times that he loves them, that they are his beloved. God did ridiculous things for Israel when he brought them out of Egypt. We remember those stories. We heard them last year. We read them together, and we thought about, this is amazing. This God is incredible and does powerful things. Not only does he bring Israel out of Egypt, but then in the wilderness, he sustains these people for 40 years through all kinds of miraculous ways. And then he brings them from the wilderness into a land that's inhabited, and he sets them up as a people, and he fulfills his promises to them that he made hundreds of years earlier. I mean, this is incredible. And what the Bible tells us is that God made himself known to the surrounding nations through these works. Part of the deal, part of the relationship that God has with Israel is he says, once you're established in the land, there's a responsibility that you have to keep making me known. There's a sense in which I will make myself known by getting you here, and then you have a role to play in continuing that, in making me known through the world. And so how are they supposed to do that? Well, they tell stories of what God has done in the past. They were to live in such a way that their neighbors were curious about this God of theirs. Who is this strange God who makes you do such strange things? They were to be hospitable so that as their neighbors began to come closer and to say, who is this God of yours? They would say, come among us and let us tell you and show you. Israel was to make God known through their words and through their lives and through their society and through their worship. And the story goes that they utterly failed at this task. Israel ultimately ends up looking no different than their neighbors. And so there's nothing distinct about Israel and those who live around them that would make God stand out as the only true God in the world. But Israel's God is just like the rest of our gods. And so he allows Israel to die. He allows Israel to lose everything that made them God's people publicly. Their land, their temple, their kingdom, the very presence of God in their midst. God lets Israel as a nation cease to exist. God understands, seems to understand. I feel like he understands a lot of stuff, and if, makes sense. But that is, his reputation is going to be smeared by allowing Israel to be crushed. And we read this in verse 5, Isaiah 52, verse 5, the last part of it. Their rulers wail, and continually all the day my name is despised. Why would God's name be despised? Because in a day when the mightiest gods win and the weakest gods lose, the God of Israel is taking a huge PR hit. And it's bad enough that the nations are going to turn and they're going to mock Israel and they're going to mock Israel's God. But it's worse than that, because back in chapter 49, we hear Israel themselves saying, the Lord has forsaken us. He's forgotten us. Who is the Lord? So we can say that by the end of Israel's exile in Babylon, God's public approval ratings are at an all-time low. The people have lost faith in their God, such that when God announces, I'm going to rescue you through this prophet, Israel can't even believe it, let alone trust it and walk in light of it. These are dark days for God's people. And yet God seems to think that all of this is worth it. And I don't know if you still are thinking, trying to put yourself in God's mind here, like, I don't know if this is making perfect sense. But as chapter 52 continues, we begin to catch a glimpse of how God could possibly see all of this as worth it. In 52, we hear that a day is coming when messengers from all over the earth begin to announce that there is good news, that Israel's God rules. And these messengers are gonna proclaim this good news that God rules, and they're gonna come from far off mountains all the way to the city of Jerusalem. And the question is, what will trigger this good news? And it's God's self-vindication. He has promised to release these people from captivity, and now he does. When God proves himself to be trustworthy and right and powerful, when Israel emerges from their Babylonian grave, the seemingly impossible will have happened, and there will be no doubt who rescued Israel from their extinction. And God will be praised. Or that's the hope. But Isaiah paints a picture of Israel as having a really hard time accepting this. If you think about what it looks like to walk out of a season of suffering, how easily do we accept the suffering that we've encountered? How easy is it to make sense of it, to have a perspective that lets us sort of walk in a new way of engaging in the world? Israel can't seem to get past their exile. They cannot make sense of it. It all feels like a waste. It feels like God must have abandoned them. There's no way that God would have allowed them to go through this. And they're just not sure what to do now. It's to these people that the vision of God's wise servant, suffering servant, is then given. And this is what the servant does. The servant claims to speak on God's behalf. The servant claims to be speaking for God. And the servant is announcing, the saving arm of the Lord has come to rescue Israel. He is a prophet, but he's rejected and he's hated. The people turn away from him and they despise him and his message, but the people have ultimately misunderstood him. They have not had eyes to see and ears to hear. They've heard this prophet speaking, but they cannot believe that he is speaking a true word from God. And so 53, we're in 53, and we read this, strangely, starting in verse 4. Surely he, the prophet, has borne, or the servant has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. Something has begun to change for these people. I don't know if you could hear it there. They heard the prophet and they hated his message. They turned from him, and perhaps they were even the ones who were then responsible for killing him. And since false prophets are supposed to die, they assume that his pain and his suffering was being caused by God, right? So you have a prophet among you who is suffering and he's afflicted, and everybody's looking at him and they're like, no, you're a false prophet, and he begins to die or he dies. It's the community's assumption that clearly he was a false prophet, because that's what happens to false prophets. And this is the attitude that they have about him. Surely this prophet is being punished and getting what he deserves for speaking such lies. But something weird has happened. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, they say. Something in their perception of what's happened is changing. So in verse 6, we hear the people confess, all we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way. Something profound is happening to the people. At first, they accused him, the prophet, of sinning against God. That's why he's dying. But now they've seen and recognized somehow their own sin. Their sin was what had turned them away from God, and which is what resulted in them rejecting God's prophets and God's words. And so this prophet didn't actually die because of his own sin, as they thought. They're coming to realize he died because of their sin. They are the ones that put him to death in their anger about his message. And so through the prophet's death, they have come to see their sin. And through seeing their sin, they've come to confess their sin. And through confessing their sin, God has forgiven them. In this way, the prophet was an offering for sin. This is where this passage is wild. The people put the prophet to death, and the prophet goes willingly, somehow trusting God, that even if he dies, this all works out. And he serves the people by speaking the truth to them, and then he gives his life freely over for them by suffering and enduring pain and death. And the amazing thing is the people think they're doing God a favor by putting to death this false prophet, but instead, God is using their actions to do them a favor. God vindicates the prophet when he sets Israel free from captivity, and the people begin to realize what they've done. This prophet is announcing God is releasing you from captivity, and they go, there's no way, you're clearly a false prophet. And then God releases them from captivity, and they go, darn, we missed that one. The prophet had been speaking the truth all along. And so in that moment, their view of the world, their view of themselves, and their view of the prophet have changed entirely. They are the sinners. And the prophet was the faithful servant who died to show them how deep their rejection of God was. You know your rejection of God is deep when you reject the people that God sends to you to be life-giving and to speak his words for you. Confronting the truth about the prophet, they're then forced to begin to reinterpret the events of the past in light of what God has now done. And by reinterpreting the past, specifically the suffering of the servant, going from thinking he was afflicted by God to he's an offering for them, they find out that they need to begin to reinterpret their own past. They need to understand that when God allowed Babylon to destroy and devastate Israel, that this was not all pointless suffering. This is the conclusion they've come to. This was all meaningless. But their death as a nation was not in vain. God allowed Israel to die so that he could raise Israel to new life. Babylon thought they had killed Israel. Babylon imagined that Israel's God was either too weak or altogether abandoned Israel. That's the only explanation for how Israel comes to be defeated and ends up in exile. But God offers another explanation. God has not forsaken his people. He went with them into exile. He sustained them in exile. He continued to bless them in exile so that they might be a blessing to their captors in exile. But they haven't seen any of this. They haven't recognized any of this. And so that when the time was then right, God acted, bearing his arm, setting Israel free. Israel has then been given new life, and Israel's God is vindicated. And so setting Israel free to see how her death as an established nation was not the end of them, but an opportunity for God to be glorified, for God to demonstrate his power, and for God to establish himself as the king who is mightier than any other king or any nation's gods. The suffering of this servant teaches God's people to face death and realize that it doesn't have to be in vain, that God is able to overcome. But this is a choice that Israel has. It can waste its time in exile, refusing to learn from the experience and the suffering, or Israel can embrace its new life and walk in an ever-deepening trust in her God. Hopefully you see the pattern, that when God reigns on earth, the dead are brought back to life. Whether it is the prophet's message that's given new life for the people or the entire nation of Israel itself at this time, God is interested in how his people die and how they understand their deaths. And yet, when Jesus shows up several hundred years later, God's people have clearly not been able to sustain this transformed imagination, this transformed perspective. The people are over the top excited to announce Jesus as the king, the one who will restore and demonstrate God's reign on earth forever. They're over the top that he's going to be their king. But when Jesus says things like, as your king, I will suffer and I will die and I will be raised, they just can't even engage that. There's just nothing. They can't make sense of the reality that this king might die for them. And there's a reason why nobody before the time of Jesus ever connected these passages of a suffering servant to the Messiah, because Messiahs are kings, and kings don't die, at least not the way a servant does, not the way that Jesus did. And so what does it say about God that he would take on human flesh, and then that he would take his place among his people as their king, and then that he would offer himself in death, suffering at their hands and dying a criminal's death? Who is this God? This is bizarre. Gods in the world don't do this. He's the God who wants his people to see how deep their rebellion goes, that they would even put to death their own God when he shows up in their midst. But he's also the God who wants them to stop fearing death. Most of their rebellion, for most of their history, is oriented to a fear of death, and he wants them to stop fearing death. He is the God who raised Jesus from the grave, vindicating himself and vindicating the words that Jesus had spoken. If this God overcomes death, then surely he can be trusted with all of the things that he has promised, and surely we can then do the things that he has called us to do. In fact, this is exactly what the early church then demonstrates. The suffering, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus so transformed their understanding of death that these ordinary men and women, they began to take on this identity as the suffering servant themselves. We hear the apostles at various points describing themselves with this kind of language. Paul talks about himself being poured out as a drink offering for the Philippian church. Jesus turns to his disciples and says, this is the kind of life you are to live. You are to be the last. You are to be a servant. This is who I am, and this is the life I am inviting you into. When we let Isaiah 52 and 53 be just a set of predictions about Jesus, we miss the call that they place on our lives. Jesus has come, and he has offered himself as an offering for our sin. And it's clear that growing up, reading this passage over and over again shaped his understanding of who he was and what he was being called to do by the Father. He has come as our King, and he has raised us to new life. But as a part of this, of God's redeemed community, we now give ourselves over, or maybe more accurately, God gives us over to serving the world, to making God's name known in every corner of the earth, to demonstrating God's loving kindness and steadfast faithfulness in all places and in all areas of our lives, even if that does result in our death. It's interesting that in last week and this week, what we see in Isaiah is an announcement that Israel is going to be set free from captivity. But more than that, they're going to have their hearts transformed, because there is no peace for the wicked. In other words, it doesn't matter how your circumstances change. There's something that has to happen inside of us that brings us into relationship with God, that sets us free to be the people that God has made us to be. This is one of the reasons why in the New Testament, the idea that Israel would have the land restored to them just is a non-argument, is a non-issue, I should say, because throughout Scripture, Israel has demonstrated that all they rely on is a change of circumstances, a change of location. But for early on, God is saying, I need you to be my people wherever you are. And so we discover in the New Testament this call to live as faithful exiles, that wherever we are in the world, we are called to pour out our lives, servants, suffering for the sake of our neighbors, knowing that if death is the end, death is not the end. Because, oh death, where is your victory? Death, where is your sting?